the turbulence of Islamabad would draw him back. I rather doubt whether there is a more turbulent base for a senior Australian to actually be operating from. Peter seems remarkably relaxed and unruffled. But as some of you will know, Peter Heyward has had 3 head of mission appointments. I think it's 3. He was our first ambassador to Timor-Leste. Now that was an interesting challenge in the first place, because all the reactions or the consequences of the interventions, of the struggles there, which led to internet force being sent in, and our recognition of Timor-Leste necessitated, of course, the appointment of an ambassador. But he's also served as head of mission in a far, far bigger country, one that's looming much larger and more immediately in our own orbit, Brazil. And he's had a string of other appointments as well. So his appointment in mid-2012 to Islamabad didn't come as a surprise to those of us who have been following his career path. And he's back on leave. It's of interest, of course, that he has to go back. It's not the end of his term. And we don't often get the opportunity to hear an ambassador who's in mid-term, who's going back to face further, we hope not danger, but to further challenges at any rate, because Australia's interests are very much at stake in that part of the world. I was speculating a little earlier with Peter as to whether or not there is some reluctance in the Australian public mind, or in the minds of many of its citizens, to accord Pakistan the influence it deserves. I mean, the importance that it deserves in our thinking. And I think of the Australian media, and although there are reports of the latest bomb blasts, or yesterday's was another set of oil tankers being blown up in Baluchistan, and further threats of violence in Karachi if the British arrest or maltreat a person who's in voluntary exile in London, who seems to hold the fate of Karachi in his hands. These extraordinarily dramatic choices, which don't apply in most of our overseas capitals with which we maintain close diplomatic relations. So I've said enough, and I just really wanted to provide a little bit of background to Peter's current assignment. I can't think of a more interesting one, but there are undoubtedly a lot of Australians who simply don't think Pakistan deserves the prominence in the press that I think it deserves. And Peter may be able to explain or to offer an opinion as to why that is so, or whether it is so, and whether it can be combated. So I have much pleasure in inviting His Excellency Peter Heyward to speak to us on recent developments in Pakistan. Peter.
Much Dana. It's a bit more comfortable here. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be back here, and it's great to renew the acquaintance with you, which goes back a very long way, and also to see some old friends in the audience. It's your preliminary comments, I think, are quite useful ones in setting the scene, because I think the knowledge that most people have of Pakistan is about those bomb blasts, those terrible images which repeatedly and fairly regularly appear on television, and the sort of prurience interest that the world has in these sort of disasters, also natural disasters. I mean, every year there is major flooding in Pakistan. It varies in intensity and location, but nonetheless, issues which haven't really warranted any reporting still managed to dislocate many millions of people from their lands and kill many people. It's that sort of place. So what I thought I'd do is just go back a bit and try and unpick some of the factors that are behind what happens, those images, and hopefully that will help illuminate both why Pakistan is important to the world, but also why people are a little reluctant to applaud it, that level of importance. I mean, as an initial comment, I'd say that partly it would be because to get too far behind the scenes is actually quite complicated. There's a lot of interweaving the themes, pressures, interests that are at stake. But I know many of you have quite good backgrounds in history, but let's just go back a little to Pakistan's creation. It was at the end of the British Raj, the separation of India and Pakistan into two separate states, largely on religious lines. There's a whole lecture to be given on why that happened and how that happened, but suffice to say, Pakistan was created as an Islamic state, but as a secular Islamic state, a state which was defined by the fact that it was peopled largely by Muslims, but it wasn't supposed to be a theocracy, or it wasn't supposed to be defined by religion. This was the vision that the architects of the state, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Iqbal, had of the state. It was supposed to be secular. It was supposed to be able to accommodate Christians, Hindus, Parsis and other minorities that lived there. Needless to say, the division, and it was a violent and quick but violent one, of the two states, created tensions between India and Pakistan, which persist today. Not the least the territory of Kashmir, which was very predominantly Muslim, but the then ruler of that area was persuaded by the British and the Indians to stay within the Indian state, and that's been a constant source of irritation, and there's still fighting on what's called the line of control, the border between the effectively Indian-controlled land and effectively Pakistani-controlled land. There's also a huge diversity within the country. You shouldn't assume that the fact that the vast majority are Muslim means that there's a unity in other ways. Significant racial diversity, tribal diversity, significant linguistic diversity. There are parts of the country which speak mutually unintelligible languages. So the selection of Urdu and English to be the predominant languages has created some tensions. There's still some separatist movements, particularly in Balochistan, which is the province adjacent to Afghanistan, where there's a movement there which would prefer the country to be a separate state, or there are some who have it merged with Afghanistan. The English, of course, left a significant heritage in other ways. It's the legal system, the governance system is still largely British-based, which is one of the reasons why Australians find it so easy to work their way through the governance systems there. But they also left not only the disputed border on the Indian side, but also on the Afghan side, where the Durand line is still not recognised by Afghanistan as the border between the two countries. And you have the Pashtun people and their various sub-tribes, the Wazirs and others, who straddle that border. So it's a complicated area. That particular part of Afghanistan, which is to the north and to the west. Land law is also a complicated element in Pakistan, and part of that is because of the whole process of separation, of partition, where landowners from the Pakistan side, what is now Pakistan, went to India if they were Hindu, and vice versa. So a lot of people lost title to their lands, others assumed, and it continues today to be a problem where who has title, and the idea that you can take title by force or by subterfuge or by other ways. There's also the legacy of religion, where we were talking a little bit about this earlier. Even though it's predominantly Muslim, of those are around 21, 22% are Shia Muslims. The rest are mostly Sunni, and most of the Sunnis, though there's a huge diversity, are tending towards the stronger, more austere form of Islam that comes out of Saudi Arabia, or Wahhabism. Geographically, there are those who, in particular some revisionist historians, who claim that Pakistan was always a state. There was always a people centred around the Indus Valley. And you can make a cogent claim for it because it's such an important agricultural society. It has been for a long, long time. There's various parts at which it can be crossed easily, and they form the great routes of movement of the Mongols and Genghis Khan and others who've been travelling through the country in many centuries ago as the history of that area evolved. But it's a real food basket. The development of irrigation systems under the Raj helped that immensely, but it's a very, very fertile plain which has been a strong agricultural producer for many, many centuries. I've mentioned the disputed borders already, but it has other interesting neighbours as well, of course, with Afghanistan, which is still under, well, some would say foreign occupation, others would say a mission to assist in dealing with an internal terrorist problem. But that process is still underway, not to finish until at least the end of 2014. The border with Iran is far more peaceful, but nonetheless there are complications there. There are movements of population through there, people trying to get up into Europe. There's the Sunni-Shia divide, which finds expression at the border at times. It also has other interesting neighbours in the region. I've mentioned already Saudi Arabia, which has a tremendous influence still in the country, both financial and religious. Turkey is another very important partner, ideologically more than any. In the early days of Turkey's development as a secular state, they took a lot of, took Pakistan as a model and drew a lot on the sort of government structures that they developed to have Islam expressed within the constitution but not dominating it. And now the reverse is true. I think Pakistan looks much more towards Turkey as an Islamic state which has made its way into the 20th century as a booming economy, and in which the balance between state and religion is relatively well managed, though recently we've seen some threats to that as well. There's also the whole of Central Asia coming out of the thrall of the Soviet Union, but an area where there's massive natural resources, in particular energy and minerals, and the potential links with those countries are ones which consume a little bit of strategic thinking in the country. And of course China, which is to the north and is seen by Pakistan as its most reliable and most useful ally. The Chinese don't see Pakistan in quite the same light, but nonetheless there are close relations between the two. Contemporary Pakistan is a large population, still under 200 million, but growing, getting there fast. A young population and getting younger as time goes on. It's a country which is having difficulty meeting even the most basic of the Millennium Goals. In other words, it's behind in most indicators of health, education, and other indicators of development. It's still very strongly tribal. In other words, you don't have to dig very far underneath the surface to find relationships that are based on family and tribal aerial links, and these come through inheritance, but they also there's a lot of responsibilities that adhere to family links. So what becomes problematic nepotism within governments is usually based on tribal lines or family obligations. It's also mostly an agricultural country. The vast majority of people are engaged in agriculture. But within that, there's a strong industrial base. I mean, as a country that's produced and sustained very sophisticated nuclear weaponry, can manufacture aircraft and vehicles designed and built there. So it's quite a sophisticated industrial base, but still the vast majority of people engaged in agriculture. The economy is big, as you'd expect for a country that size, but it's the per capita is very small. It's not least developed, but well down the bottom of the developed category in UN terms. It has these days very low direct foreign investment. Most foreign investors see it as too great a risk for either security or sovereign risk type issues. It has a high government debt. Most of the lending of the banks within the country is to the government itself to enable it to keep afloat. Very low tax base. Agriculture, for instance, is almost completely excluded from the tax collection. So the formal economy is not in good shape at all. And there are suggestions that if things keep on going in the wrong direction, it could run the risk of a currency collapse. I don't think that's likely in the short term, but it's an ever-present possibility. But the contrary side is that there are very entrepreneurial people. The wealth that does exist there is largely held in a small number of, relatively small number of families, large families. So again, back to this tribal theme, they have a lot of capital. They invested in various different areas. One of the things that's come to Australian attention is, as they've had, and I'll mention this a bit later, an energy crisis, they've moved their capital into areas which are less energy intensive, and one of these is dairy. And the best place to get dairy stock from is Australia. So we've had a large export business in getting dairy cattle into Pakistan, which form the basis of their dairy herd. And they are the third biggest milk producer in the world. So, I mean, this is a country which is capable of producing large amounts of agricultural produce, but they export virtually none of it. So part of that exercise is to value add and start getting the milk into the particularly Middle Eastern markets where they get paid a premium. I'm diverting myself a little bit. So it is entrepreneurial. There is capital in the country. There is a very energetic economy, but a lot of it is an informal economy. In other words, it doesn't go through government channels. There's a lot of barter, a lot of investments which are done in ways which don't attract government attention. So where does that leave the country at the moment? What are the major issues facing it? I mentioned energy. It's got a chronic energy shortage, which obviously affects life in general, but also the economy. It also affects the industry of the country. This is partly due to lack of capacity, which obviously lack of investment would affect. But it's mostly due to a crippling circular debt, which is basically that nobody pays their debts. Therefore, those who rely on payments to pay their own debts aren't able to do so, and the government being the biggest defaulter. So this has become a problem which has left production capacity significantly diminished. One family I know who has a power generation capacity as part of their industrial portfolio said they hadn't been paid by the government for 3 years for their production. They kept the power plants flowing, but they had no incentive, obviously, to increase the production when they weren't going to get any benefit from it. Secondly, corruption remains a problem. And it's the sort of corruption that most of you, I guess, would understand how it operates from the very lowest levels and as you go up. For small transactions within the bureaucracy, usually a premium is required to make it happen. As you go further up into the government, major projects, there's a percentage required for permission to be granted in different areas. This is well documented, well understood, but very, very difficult to root out without very strong governance from the top. And the history of Pakistan has been democratically elected governments, then periods of dictatorship. And part of the reason that those coups have taken place has been people's frustration with corruption becoming tougher and tougher and harder to manage, and the diversion of resources just becoming crippling. So the military's come in, and with the sorts of honesty and integrity for which they clearly have a strong reputation, but they haven't necessarily been good at applying the controls that are needed to fix the problem. They've usually been successful in the short term, but as time goes on, the clamour for greater freedom becomes stronger, democracy returns, fails, and there's been another coup. Where we are in that cycle at the moment is the first ever handover from one democratically elected government to another has just recently happened in Pakistan. So this is, I think, a very good sign. The previous government was not one which was lauded for its clampdown on corruption. The new government has come in with strong views in that area and has started to make moves in the right direction. So there's a reason for some hope that might happen. But the further you get into it, the more vested interests are affected, and the questions as to whether the government will have the stomach to actually make the reforms that are necessary becomes asked. The third problem, obviously, is security, and that's the one which people know the most about, I think. And there's a range of issues that feed into that. I've mentioned the fact that there's different religious interests there. Some of the terrorist acts you hear about are Sunnis versus Shia and vice versa. So there's sectarianism, which is one of the elements. There's also within the country radical Islamicists who want to establish an Islamic caliphate in the country with a Sharia law, and they are against the government, they're against the military, they're against Western involvement. There are also terrorists whose main interest is in having Kashmir rejoined as part of Pakistan. So they inhabit the eastern side of the country, and their focus is acts in India, and the Mumbai bombings, which most of you will have heard and remember, were the act of one of these major groups, the Lashkar-e-Taiba. There are also violence for commercial reasons. We mentioned Karachi earlier. It's a city which is divided politically, divided commercially, divided racially, divided tribally, and violence can occur for any one of those reasons, often linked. Also, violence and terrorism, kidnapping, extortion are used as means of funding terrorism for other purposes. So money going through extortion then goes into setting up training camps, which then produce terrorists, suicide bombers who can operate in other parts of the country and buys arms. So it's a very complicated security arrangement, situation, but it's not unified within the country. There are quite distinct problems in different parts. Up in the north and to the west, the border with Afghanistan, that's mostly terrorism which is related to the conflict in Afghanistan. It's mostly Islamic fundamentalism or Pashtun nationalism, or for want of a better word. In Karachi, as I've said, it's a mixture of a whole range of issues. In Punjab, on the eastern side, it's more related to the conflict with India. So there's no one solution to any of these problems, which obviously places the government in a significantly problematic situation. They have the most significant and best organised institution, the army, available to them, but obviously the military is loath to fight against its own people, and that's what these operations require. They've done that in parts of the country, in South Waziristan, but it came at a tremendous cost. I mean, the army technique is to basically obliterate the landscape, resettle the people elsewhere, try and recreate the landscape and then move them back in. This is hugely disruptive, hugely costly, hugely difficult in resource terms for them. It would be very difficult to do that throughout the country. So, three almost intractable problems: the energy infrastructure problem, corruption and security, all interweaving. But that said, as I said, it's still got a lively economy. It's still there's a tremendous resilience among the people. That tribal system means that people do work together and look after one another, and that has prevented anything like a state collapse. And I think most commentators think that the idea of the whole country falling apart is very unlikely, because there are so many things that hold it together. But the risk of a currency collapse or a major war with India, if there's another huge terrorist incident, especially with two nuclear-armed states, obviously these are the sorts of things that worry people as to what might happen in the future. For Australia, and this gets back to Peter's original question, I suppose, what's our interest there? Well, clearly, this is a country that has the capacity to destabilise not only the region but the whole global system if things go wrong. So one of the answers I give to Peter's question is why are people reluctant to give it the credit it's due as its importance. A lot of that importance is a kind of a negative importance. If things go wrong, Pakistan will be hugely influential in a very negative way. Obviously, as a High Commissioner there, with a trade and promotion angle as well to my work, we do a lot of work to try and find the positive angles to it. And the basic task of the High Commission is to, if you like, maintain connection with Pakistan as a modern democratic state, and on the assumption that we are a partner in helping to deal with these problems that it's facing. And to a large extent, that's successful. Australia is welcomed as a partner, not the major partner, of course. That's reserved for much bigger players globally. But so I come from there. I'm not pessimistic. It's hard to say that I'm optimistic because the problems are so significant. But I'm not pessimistic to the extent that I think that the country is likely to face major breakdowns in the short term. But I think progress to utilise its resources, human and otherwise, in the way in which is possible and was envisaged when the country was created is quite a long and difficult track, and it's one where we play a role with the rest of the international community in trying to help it make the changes and perform the actions that are necessary to get to that position. But it's slow, difficult work, and whether the country has the stomach for it, I guess we have to wait and see. So that's a picture of contemporary Pakistan. It's not entirely a pretty one, but I guess I'd leave you with a couple of very positive images. I mean, one of the things the country is famous for, justifiably, is the tremendous hospitality and generosity of its people, and which is one of the things that makes living there largely a pleasure. This is largely, the people know me largely as sort of from the elite, the ruling elite. But nonetheless, they're wonderfully generous, friendly people, very intelligent, well-read, thoughtful, and they care a tremendous amount about their country. And when you're talking to them and looking to the future, you can see how things might be able to work out. So that's, I guess, the sense of resilience and a robustness about the country, which is not, again, readily apparent from the outside world. So I think I'd end with a mildly optimistic note. But I've covered a lot of territory, as you can tell. It's a fascinating, complex, multi-layered place. So I hope my narrative has made some sense to you. But I'm very happy to answer questions, Peter, if that's possible. And I'm very happy to talk to people about it. I'll come back, no doubt, in another couple of years with a whole lot of other views. It's that sort of place, but a wonderful, fascinating place, but a place with some problems, without a doubt. Thank you, Peter.